NANDROLONES. Okay, so I'm going to try to go through this without my notes, and then I'll probably update some stuff at the end with my notes. So here's the anabolic chart where I have different compounds up. So nandrolones right here. It's got an androgen receptor affinity of 154. So everything's compared against test, right? So test is 100 androgen receptor affinity, 100 anabolic rating, 100 androgen rating, just for comparison's sake. Estrogen is 20% conversion, so 100 milligrams of testosterone, once aromatase gets a hold of it, is like 100 is 80 test and 20 estrogen and about 5 DHT. So it's really like 75 test, 5 DHT, 20 estrogen. Okay. This is what gets a little confusing for people, is that there's a lot of myths about nandrolone, and it's because they don't understand aromatase and 5-alpha reductase and how they break down tests. And you probably might want to review anabolic episodes 1, 2, and 5 to get the picture on that. But basically, nandrolone, it's a 154, so it's almost 50% as strong and is likely to bind as testosterone. So it's like if you got 10 molecules of nandrolone and 10 molecules of testosterone, and you got 10 receptors, and androgen receptors. 6 of those androgen, or 7 of those androgen receptors will be bound to nandrolone. 3 will be bound to test. So you've got more tests floating in the system, which means more will get converted to estrogen. All right, anabolic rating. Now, it's a little confusing, but basically, you see I've got a 400 to 125 and a 10 to a 50. It's because studies are all over the place, but I re-looked, and the study that has the 400 has a 20. The study that has a 200 has a 10. And the study that has a 125 has a 50. So it's really like a 20 to 1 ratio of anabolic to androgenic rating, which is better than Anavar's 322 to 24. Also, when you consider how much stronger of a binder it is, it's more efficacious for growing muscle to use nandrolone. You see that trend in comparison is much more androgenic, and we'll get to the advantage of that later. Even though it's a weaker binder, it's more androgenic. One thing I want to point out too is over here I added something special, because nandrolones are made from progesterone, not testosterone. Nandrolone has a 20 binding affinity for progesterone receptor. Trend has a 74. Now, before you could jump ahead of yourself and you're like, well, progesterone's good because it deactivates estrogen receptors. Well, supposedly it's an incomplete or a partial agonist. So it doesn't, kind of like how tamoxifen doesn't do what estrogen does on estrogen receptors in all tissues. These nandrolones act differently in different tissues on progesterone receptors. People don't really understand them. Okay, now we're going to get over to the structure. So this is a testosterone molecule, right? Right here, when you convert that ketone into an alcohol group, that's an alcohol group, a hydroxyl group, it's now an estrogen. You need this double bond there to do that. If you were to 5-alpha reduce, meaning the 5 carbon, you come at it from the back and you take that off, what you get is DHT. Now, this is nandrolone, I'm sorry. Testosterone has a methyl group here. Nandrolone does not, so I should erase this because that's confusing. So that's what makes a 19-nor different from a testosterone, is there's not the 19 bound carbon. So if we were to 5-alpha reduce this, what we have is DHN, not DHT. So DHN is a lot weaker than normal nandrolone, whereas DHT has a 5 times binding affinity. So whereas the testosterone has a binding affinity of 100, DHT has a binding affinity of 500. But nandrolone's DHN is so weak. So you're like, well, wait a minute, that's good, right? Because then it's not androgenic, it's purely anabolic. But that's one of the handful of little minor things that adds up to the myth that nandrolone causes a lot of gyno. Firstly, there's a study, the 12-week study, with 600 milligrams of nandrolone per week for 12 weeks. Duh. And it added 9 pounds to people with HIV and AIDS. Now keep in mind, these are skinny, underfed people. You could probably it'd probably be very easy to add 9 pounds to them. It'd be harder to add 9 pounds to someone who's 250 pounds of solid muscle. But for this study, you've got some virgin non-steroid user. They didn't put them on 200. They didn't put them on 250. They didn't put them on 200 test 200 nandrolone. They put them on 600 fucking nandrolone. He gained 9 pounds in 12 weeks. That's a whole group of people, not one dude. And none of them had any side effects. Not even gyno. So how much fucking nandrolone does someone have to use to get these side effects? Well, this is one of the things, is that by having the DHN, not the DHT, you've now had a lot of androgen loss. So the androgen to estrogen ratio isn't shifted so heavily by estrogen going up, because the estrogen conversion of nandrolone is only 10%, not 20%. So it's less estrogenic than testosterone, but it's way less androgenic than testosterone. And one of the coolest features of DHT is it binds to SHBG and gums it up so it can't bind free test. And DHT binds to the aromatase enzyme and works like an aromatase inhibitor, stopping that estrogen conversion. If you took this DHT out, this estrogen conversion would go up from 20%. So what happens is, over time, the DHN doesn't do what the DHT is supposed to do. So even though there's a muscle growth effect, there's a loss of masculinity effect. So the loss of masculinity will result in a lack of sex drive and libido, because DHT acting on the prostate and the penis is a large amount of the stimulation. You know, phantom dick, when you take Cialis and have no DHT, it's hard, but you can't feel it. You know, it's the classic, is it in type question, which always gets you in trouble. So likewise, if you don't have any DHT binding to the prostate at all, you're probably not going to ejaculate. So there's a lot that goes into that. And for sexual function shit, check out episode 8, the Proviron episode. This is about nandrolone, and yes, I'm talking about Deca dick. And the point is, Deca dick is really a lot more confusing than just that the progesterone could have a function. A lot of people blame prolactin, and the prolactin effect involves the phosphodiesterase pathway. So if you take a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, like a 10% dose, like a 3 milligram, not a 25, a 3 milligram dose of Cialis before chest, shoulders, and arms, basically 3 times a week out of 7, because it's got a 36-hour half-life. If you take a 10% dose, that usually is going to give you enough to counteract whatever prolactin effects it has on your dick to cause you to get a limp dick. Basically, it gets hard, but then the first time you lose your erection, you can't get a second erection. Not counting a refractory period for post-ejaculation, just like if you gotta piss, or if they start whining or their sister calls and they have to talk to their sister because that's more important than anything. Then, then therefore, when it's time to get it hard again, then you can't. That's Deca dick from prolactin, not from a lack of sex drive, and not phantom dick from a lack of DHT binding. So what a lot of people do is they mix some stuff together. I find that using a little bit of tren with a little bit of nandrolone, you get all that androgenic effect there. Or some people use an oral like Anadrol to do that, to give you the DHT you need. Personally, I think the tren thing makes more sense, but you don't want to run tren all the time. So I think if tren is something you run with IGF-1 for 3 weeks, tren acetate with IGF-1 for 3 weeks, then when you're off, you would run NPP. So we talk about nandrolone. Nandrolone has different ester lengths, right? Deca is a 7-day half-life. It's got a 10. That's where the term Deca comes from. 10 carbon bound to position 17. So instead of this alcohol group here, there's 10 carbon chain coming off. And that, when that's bound, that's why it's 64%, is because that 10 carbon chain takes up 36% of the total molecule's weight. So once that ester gets broken off by the vasoendothelial cells and it enters your bloodstream, this is the actual molecule that circulates and binds to the androgen receptor somewhere else. The NPP is only 4% more, but for some reason, once we get to this bioavailability chart, what they found was that the total area under the curve, the amount of actual usable nandrolone during any given amount of time, is higher with NPP by a large margin. Nandrolone propionate, it's hard to find. That's like a every other day injection. So this is every 7 days, supposedly half-life, but you'd really inject half your load every 4. This is an every 3-day half-life, but really people inject half their load every 2. And then nandrolone propionate would be like every 2 to 1 days. It's 83% pure. So it's just more bang for your buck depending on math. Now, I put in some testosterone cypionate just as a reference. It's 70% test, 30% ester. Anaphate is 28% ester. And tren acetate is 87% tren, only 13% ester. So what you do is, when you got 300 Deca, what you really got is like 192 Deca. When you've got 300 tren, you really have like 265 tren. So that's something you might want to consider when you're switching from a long-acting like tren naphate, 72% pure, tren acetate's 87% pure. There's a little bit of math involved, and you have to use less of the short-acting stuff because it's more potent, plus area under the curve. So bioavailability, this doesn't make any sense to a lot of people, me included, but 1 milliliter in the glute, 73% actually ever makes it to your bloodstream. 4 milliliters in the glute, only 53%. Basically, the size of the ball has greater surface area. So the surface area to volume ratio of a small droplet of oil versus a large droplet of oil means there's more capillaries per surface for the small droplet of oil, so it absorbs in the bloodstream faster, so more is actually a usable thing, so the area under the curve is actually better. Whereas a delt injection is 56, probably because it's a smaller muscle, it gets less blood flow than like a glute, which gets a ton of blood flow because you're walking on it all day. You don't use your delts that much. So what they found was, it's something similar to this, that the same amount of Deca would be here than NPP there. That for some reason the phenylpropionate has a higher bioavailability and you get more area under the curve than you do with Deca. Now I'm going to go check my notes and see if I missed anything really important. So there are a few things in my notes I want to add to clear up the Deca thing. One thing is the shift from estrogenic to estrogenic feminine away from masculine or DHT because the lack of DHT. It's simply like you're losing a 400 anabolic and 50 androgenic compound to make something that has almost no androgenic versus losing something that's got a 100 androgenic and that gets converted to DHT, which is a 500 androgenic. And the DHT is an anti-estrogen, so over time the balance shifts longer and more towards the estrogen. And then since estrogen shuts down natural test, that means that Deca is way more of a shutdown anabolic than testosterone. That doesn't make any sense. That nandrolone shuts you down really hard because a long-term effect is you're going to have more estrogen downstream than the actual conversion of the nandrolone molecule to estrogen. Now, if that seems confusing to you, just think of it this way. It causes you to have more shutdown, and there's no male fraction. The nandrolone is not a male anabolic hormone. It's the only nandrolone is the only anabolic steroid made from a female hormone, progesterone. So females, less masculine. Women don't have dicks. So your loss of libido, impotency, growing breast tissue, all come from the fact that it's a female hormone. So usually people would mix a male, like a DHT modified, like an anadrol, with it, or Tren is the strange one because even though it's made from progesterone and it's an androlone, it's extremely androgenic. So a little bit of Tren, like in the episode 10, that I said I was using 200 test long-acting, 150 long-acting nandrolone, Deca, and 100 short-acting nandrolone, NPP, for a total of 250 nandrolone. So 200 test, 250 nandrolone, and 100 trenaphate to cancel out, to add in a masculine fraction, with 50 milligrams of proviron for SHBG mopping up, even though it's a DHT molecule, and 50 milligrams anadrol pre-lift. If it's confusing, you don't remember it, go back and watch episode 10. There's no reason for me to reiterate it again. But the point I'm saying is I use 3 different androgenic compounds to cancel out the absence of androgenicity from the nandrolone. Also, it causes an increase of thyroid binding protein, and again, the trend would cancel that out. Let's see, RBCs increase more red blood cell with nandrolones than test or anadrol. And I don't know how that stacks up against EQ, but the 2 biggest are test and anadrol, so it means Deca or nandrolone, rather, the 3rd most. It actually decreases cortisol production, but for a short period of time after taking it, there's an increase in cortisol production. That's why people get the joint relief pain, is that the increased cortisol binds to those. Most of your DHT compounds like Masteron, or almost all the orals are DHT compounds. They inhibit binding of cortisol to the cortisol receptor, with the exception of stanozol or winstrol. Well, I said stanozol wrong, but winstrol is the correct street name for it, and or Winnie's. And that causes a lack of cortisol to be released at the adrenal gland. So in other words, nandrolone's almost opposite. No, it's like winstrol in that it actually inhibits cortisol release. It's just for a short period of time, you get a alleviation of the joint pain. So that's why a lot of people mix nandrolones with winstrol early on. When you're trying maybe 4 weeks out from a show, 5 weeks out from a show, when you're tapering off your NPP, you add in the winstrol a little early. You won't notice the joint pain as much as when it's on winstrol trenomasteron, which is going to be brutal. Increases collagen synthesis, so that'll help with the joints, but it doesn't do it as much as EQ, but that's pretty much the only use of EQ. 300 EQ gets you 340 increase in collagen synthesis, and in order for EQ to even be effective, it has to be at like 900. Dan Duchesne tried to push that EQ was like Deca. My understanding was he just had a bunch of extra EQ and was trying to sell it. Yep, I covered everything else. I just didn't want to bite off this huge chunk because Deca is a controversial one. People think it's bad because it's made from a feminine hormone and it's going to cause gyno and it's going to cause Decadic. And, you know, dudes with HIV were able to get it up and had no gyno with 600 milligrams. So how much fucking Deca were you using? Plus NPP, you hit a better plasma concentration and it doesn't mount up. So you can get away with more NPP side effect free than you can Deca, and it's more effective. So, I mean, a great cycle, I think, is 300 test prop, 600 NPP. That's very simple for those who are mathematically challenged. That's basically 100 test prop, 200 NPP every other day. It's a really effective cycle, and it works great most of the times. I'm not suggesting you do this. Nothing I say is medical advice. This is for entertainment purposes only. I'm discussing my personal experience, and I'm also reviewing the literature and science behind this. And that's because people just think this is a fun-filled topic.